Good evening, fellow explorers, and welcome to another journey with the Atlas Archives, where we unpack the stories that shaped our world, one nation at a time. Tonight, we're venturing north to a land so vast it makes other countries look like they're suffering from geographical modesty. Canada, the world's second largest nation, and quite possibly the politest. From the Atlantic shores where Vikings once tested the hospitality of indigenous peoples, to Pacific coastlines where mountains rise like nature's own skyscrapers, Canada sprawls across 6 time zones with the casual confidence of a country that has never met a horizon it didn't want to embrace. This is a place where you can freeze your thoughts solid in the Arctic tundra, or lose yourself in forests so dense they make fairy tales seem understated. Tonight's exploration will guide us through 10 provinces and 3 territories that somehow learn to work together despite speaking different languages, surviving winters that would humble polar bears, and maintaining the extraordinary feat of sharing the world's longest undefended border with their occasionally dramatic southern neighbour. Whether you're listening from a cozy cabin in the Rockies, a city apartment where winter lasts approximately 11 months, or somewhere wonderfully far away where the concept of ice hockey seems delightfully foreign, drop us a comment with your location. We love seeing how this community spans the globe like Canada spans, well, most of a continent. If you find yourself settling into this gentle journey through maple leaves and constitutional crises, remember to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Trust me, you'll want to be here for our upcoming deep dives. We've got some genuinely surprising stories ahead. So pour yourself something warm, find your most comfortable position, and let's begin our unhurried expedition through the true North strong and free. Chapter 1, The Great White North, an introduction to Canada's vastness. Picture, if you will, a country so enormous that it makes Russia nervous. Canada sprawls across 9.98 million square kilometers. That's 3.85 million square miles for those still clinging to imperial measurements, like a life raft in a metric ocean. To put this in perspective, you could fit the entire United Kingdom into Canada 41 times over, though one suspects the British would find the whole exercise rather redundant, having already tried to fit themselves into most places at least once throughout history. This magnificent behemoth of a nation stretches from the Pacific Ocean's temperamental waves in the west to the Atlantic's more historically documented moods in the east, and from the Great Lakes' surprisingly large puddles in the south to the Arctic Ocean's eternally grumpy demeanor in the north. It's a country that touches 3 oceans with the casual confidence of someone who's never had to worry about seasickness, though one imagines the Arctic Ocean's handshake is considerably firmer and more likely to result in frostbite. The sheer scale of Canada becomes even more amusing when you consider that this vast expanse is home to roughly 40 million people, a population density of about 3.5 people per square kilometre. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to having one person responsible for entertaining themselves across an area the size of downtown Toronto's financial district, minus the expensive coffee shops and the inexplicable number of construction cranes that seem to reproduce when no one's watching. What makes Canada particularly fascinating from a geographic perspective is its stubborn refusal to be simple. This is not a country that does anything by halves, including its weather, its landscapes, or its ability to confuse visitors about the pronunciation of various place names. Take, for instance, the fact that Canada contains approximately 60% of the world's lakes, a statistic that would be impressive if it weren't for the fact that many of these lakes are larger than some European countries and considerably more difficult to park near. The nation is divided into 10 provinces and 3 territories, a political arrangement that might seem straightforward until you realize that Nunavut, the largest territory, covers over 2 million square kilometers, but houses fewer people than a moderately successful hockey arena on game night. Meanwhile, Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province, could comfortably fit into Nunavut approximately 483 times, though why anyone would want to do such a thing remains one of geography's more perplexing thought experiments. Quebec, the largest province by area, occupies approximately 15.4% of Canada's total territory, a chunk of real estate so substantial that it makes the Louisiana Purchase look like a modest garage sale acquisition. The province stretches across 1.54 million square kilometers, which includes enough fresh water to make most desert nations weep with envy and enough French culture to make Paris occasionally wonder if they missed a memo about colonial expansion. At the opposite end of the size spectrum sits Prince Edward Island, a charming maritime province that covers just 5,660 square kilometers, roughly the size of a particularly ambitious farmer's potato field, which, coincidentally, describes a significant portion of the island's economy. The island, as locals call it, with the casual possessiveness of people who can actually see the entire border of their province from a reasonably tall ladder, proves that good things indeed come in small packages, especially when those packages include Anne of Green Gables tourism and an unseemly devotion to shellfish. The territories present their own geographical peculiarities. The Yukon Territory, despite being labelled as Canada's smallest territory, still manages to cover 482,000 square kilometres, an area that would make most European nations request a larger conference table for international summits. The Northwest Territories, meanwhile, encompass 1.3 million square kilometres of wilderness, wildlife, and the kind of winter conditions that make polar bears pack sweaters. Then there's Nunavut, established in 1999 as Canada's newest territory and immediately claiming the title of largest political subdivision in the country. Home to approximately 41,000 residents spread across 2 million square kilometres, Nunavut offers the kind of personal space that most people only dream about, assuming their dreams involve permanently frozen ground and the occasional visit from curious Arctic foxes who've clearly never heard of personal boundaries. Canada's coastline presents another exercise in geographical excess. At 151,000 miles, the Canadian coastline is longer than the Earth's equator by a comfortable margin, the kind of margin that suggests the country was designed by someone with a serious commitment to variety and a complete disregard for the convenience of coastal patrol services. This extensive maritime border touches 3 oceans, each with its own personality. The Pacific, which tends toward the dramatic and occasionally theatrical, the Atlantic, with its historical pretensions and tendency to remind everyone about important maritime disasters, and the Arctic, which maintains the conversational skills of a particularly antisocial iceberg. Within this vast territory, Canada manages to showcase virtually every climate known to meteorology, often within the same calendar week in certain regions. The country hosts no fewer than 8 distinct climate zones, each with its own particular brand of meteorological personality disorder. These range from the Pacific maritime climate, which maintains the temperament of a generally pleasant but occasionally moody oceanside resort, to the Arctic climate, which approaches weather with the enthusiasm of a particularly dedicated ice sculpture artist who's never heard the word moderation. The Pacific Maritime Climate Zone, found along British Columbia's western coast, enjoys the moderating influence of the Pacific Ocean like a permanent meteorological bodyguard. This region maintains temperatures above freezing in winter and manages to avoid the kind of summer heat that makes people question their life choices. The ocean's influence creates what climatologists politely call relief precipitation, though locals simply call it Tuesday and invest heavily in waterproof clothing and an extensive vocabulary of rain-related terminology. Moving inland, we encounter the Cordilleran climate region, where the Rocky Mountains create their own weather rules with the arbitrary authority of a particularly creative customs official. This mountainous region showcases remarkable climatic diversity over relatively short distances, where you can experience alpine conditions and valley microclimates within the same afternoon hike. Assuming you packed appropriately for both hypothermia and sunstroke, because mountain weather planning requires the kind of optimistic pessimism typically reserved for Canadian election predictions. The prairie climate region covers the vast interior grasslands with the kind of continental climate that makes meteorologists reach for superlatives and residents reach for heavier jackets. This area experiences temperature ranges that would impress a thermometer manufacturer, with winters cold enough to make polar bears reconsider their housing choices and summers hot enough to make camels pack sunscreen. The region receives most of its precipitation during the growing season, a timing that demonstrates nature's occasionally cooperative streak. Central Canada's Great Lakes St. Lawrence climate region benefits from the moderating influence of the Great Lakes, those inland seas that somehow convince themselves they're not actually oceans, despite covering an area that would make most countries nervous about their naval budgets. This region experiences what climatologists call a modified continental climate, which translates to weather that's generally reasonable but occasionally prone to dramatic episodes that remind everyone why weather prediction remains more art than science. The Atlantic Maritime Climate Region embraces the maritime influence of the Atlantic Ocean with the enthusiasm of a region that's made peace with the concept of humidity and the inevitability of fog. This climate zone produces the kind of weather that makes poets reach for their notebooks and sailors reach for their rain gear, often simultaneously. The region experiences moderate temperatures year-round, assuming your definition of moderate includes the possibility of encountering 4 seasons in a single afternoon. The subarctic climate region covers vast portions of northern Canada with the kind of climate that makes survival shows seem like tourism advertisements. This zone experiences long, brutally cold winters and brief summers that offer just enough warmth to remind the local wildlife that hibernation is indeed a reasonable lifestyle choice. The growing season lasts approximately long enough to read a moderately lengthy novel, assuming you can turn the pages while wearing mittens. Finally, the Arctic climate region embraces the far north with a climate so extreme it makes other climates feel overdressed. This zone maintains temperatures that would make a freezer feel self-conscious about its performance, with summers that barely qualify as frost-free and winters that seem to subscribe to the philosophy that if you're going to be cold, you might as well commit to the experience fully. Canada's vast river systems paint waterways across the continent with the confidence of a geography textbook come to life. The Mackenzie River system, flowing 4,200 kilometers from Great Slave Lake to the Arctic Ocean, ranks as the second longest river system in North America after the Mississippi. The river drains an area of 1.8 million square kilometers, a watershed so large it could comfortably house several European countries with room left over for a moderately ambitious shopping mall. The Great Lakes system, shared with the United States, represents one of the world's largest collections of fresh water, containing approximately 20% of the world's surface freshwater supply. These lakes demonstrate the kind of scale that makes oceanographers occasionally confused about their job description, with Lake Superior alone covering an area larger than South Carolina and maintaining depths that would make submarine crews request hazard pay. Canada's position as a global freshwater superpower becomes evident when considering that the country contains approximately 7% of the world's renewable freshwater supply. This aquatic abundance manifests in countless lakes, rivers, and streams that dot the landscape with the frequency of Tim Hortons locations in urban Ontario, which is to say, everywhere you look, and several places you hadn't thought to look. The Canadian Shield, that ancient geological formation underlying much of the country, created the foundation for this water-rich landscape through billions of years of patient geological work. This Precambrian rock formation, covering approximately half of Canada's land surface, represents some of the Earth's oldest exposed rock, a geological timeline so ancient it makes human history seem like a recent afterthought in the planet's social calendar. The concept of distance in Canada requires a fundamental recalibration of expectations for anyone arriving from smaller countries. The distance from Street, Johns, Newfoundland to Victoria, British Columbia, roughly 5,500 kilometers, represents a journey across 4.5 time zones, through 2 official languages, and past enough Tim Hortons locations to supply a small nation with double-doubles and maple-glazed donuts for approximately 17 years. This vastness creates its own cultural phenomena, including the uniquely Canadian experience of long-distance relationships that require flight plans and the development of weather conversation skills sophisticated enough to cover multiple climate zones simultaneously. Canadians routinely discuss conditions ranging from Pacific coast rain to prairie blizzards within the same phone call, a meteorological multitasking skill that impresses visiting weather forecasters and confuses tourists who thought they understood the concept of local weather. The population distribution across this vast landscape reveals Canada's preference for the southern portions of the country, where winter temperatures occasionally rise above the level that makes car engines cry. Approximately 72% of Canadians live within 150 kilometers of the US border, creating a population band that stretches across the continent like a polite invasion that decided to stay for the healthcare and public transportation. This leaves the vast majority of Canada as what geographers diplomatically term sparsely populated wilderness, territory that includes everything from northern forests filled with wildlife that's never seen a human to Arctic regions where the local residents include polar bears with territory claims larger than most European principalities. These vast, empty spaces contribute to Canada's remarkably low population density and its reputation as a country where you can still find places where the only traffic jams involve migrating caribou and the occasional stubborn moose. As we begin our detailed exploration of this remarkable nation, we embark on a journey through landscapes that include everything from temperate rainforests to Arctic tundra, through human stories that span millennia, and through political and social developments that created one of the world's most successful multicultural societies. Canada's vastness serves not just as geographical fact, but as defining characteristic, a country where distance and diversity combine to create something uniquely Canadian in its approach to nationhood, citizenship, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining unity across a space so large it makes time zones seem like a reasonable administrative necessity rather than a curious geographic artifact. Chapter 2. Before the maple leaf, Indigenous foundations and early arrivals. As we journey deeper into the remarkable tapestry that is Canada's story, we must begin where all true tales of nations start, with those who first called this vast land home. Long before European ships appeared on distant horizons like confused tourists, armed with questionable navigation skills, this continent thrived with civilizations as complex and sophisticated as any the Old World had to offer, though admittedly with better relationships with their local wildlife. The story of Canada's Indigenous peoples stretches back through millennia like a beautifully woven tapestry that makes European history look like a hastily written grocery list. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans first arrived in what we now call Canada approximately 14,000 years ago, during the last ice age, when the landscape looked considerably different and the weather was even more challenging than a modern Winnipeg winter, which is saying something. These early inhabitants crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia, embarking on what was arguably history's most ambitious hiking expedition. They arrived to find a continent covered in ice sheets that would make modern glacial tourism seem rather mundane, and somehow managed to not only survive, but flourish in conditions that would make contemporary survival show producers weep with professional envy. Over thousands of years, these founding peoples spread across the continent, adapting to diverse environments with the kind of ingenuity that would later inspire countless wilderness adventure novels. They developed into distinct nations with their own languages, cultures, spiritual beliefs, and governmental systems, creating a political landscape so complex it would give modern political scientists chronic headaches and a newfound appreciation for simplified organizational charts. By the time European explorers began appearing on Canada's coasts like uninvited dinner guests who'd forgotten to call ahead, the continent was home to hundreds of distinct indigenous nations. These peoples had spent millennia perfecting the art of living sustainably with their environment, a concept that Europeans would later struggle to understand, despite having several thousand years to work on it themselves. The three main groups recognized today in Canadian law and culture are the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis, though this represents a considerable simplification of a cultural landscape that was, and remains, far more diverse than most European countries could claim even on their most cosmopolitan days. Each group developed unique ways of life perfectly adapted to their particular corner of this vast continent. The First Nations peoples, numbering over 600 distinct communities today, developed societies ranging from the sophisticated longhouse confederacies of the eastern woodlands to the mobile hunting societies of the plains and the complex coastal cultures of the Pacific Northwest. Their governmental systems included democratic confederations that would later influence European political thought, though this contribution would be conveniently overlooked in most history textbooks for several centuries. In the eastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, created a political alliance so sophisticated that it would later inspire aspects of the American Constitution, proving that effective democracy was not, as some Europeans believed, exclusively a Greek invention. This confederacy united 6 nations under a great law of peace that governed relationships between peoples, with a complexity that made European feudal systems look like children's playground rules. The Algonquian-speaking peoples spread across much of what is now eastern and central Canada, developing societies perfectly adapted to the region's forests and waterways. They became master canoeists, creating vessels so perfectly designed for North American waters that European boat builders would spend decades trying to improve upon them, generally without success, and often with considerable embarrassment. On the Great Plains, nations like the Cree, Blackfoot, and Dakota developed mobile societies centered around the buffalo, creating one of history's most successful sustainable hunting cultures. They perfected the art of using every part of the buffalo with an efficiency that would make modern recycling enthusiasts weep with admiration, and managed vast herds with a conservation ethic that European agricultural practices would take centuries to appreciate. The Pacific Northwest coastal peoples, including the Haida, Tlingit, and Salish nations, developed some of the most artistically sophisticated cultures in North America. Their totem poles, longhouses, and ceremonial regalia demonstrated artistic achievement that would later inspire European artists and anthropologists, though often not until after they'd spent considerable time condescendingly dismissing it as primitive. In the Arctic, the Inuit had spent thousands of years mastering life in one of Earth's most challenging environments. They developed technologies for surviving in conditions that would defeat most modern outdoor enthusiasts, even with advanced gear, creating ingenious solutions for hunting, transportation, and shelter that demonstrated engineering principles Europeans hadn't yet discovered. These diverse nations maintained complex trade networks that stretched across the continent, moving goods and ideas over distances that would make modern logistics companies nervous. They traded everything from Pacific coast shells to Great Lakes copper, creating economic relationships that connected the Atlantic and Pacific long before Europeans dreamed such connections were possible. The spiritual and philosophical traditions of indigenous peoples were as diverse as their material cultures, encompassing everything from elaborate ceremonial cycles tied to agricultural seasons to shamanistic practices adapted to nomadic lifestyles. These belief systems maintained sophisticated relationships between humans and the natural world that emphasized balance and reciprocity concepts that European settlers would find both fascinating and fundamentally challenging to their worldview. Into this richly developed cultural landscape came the first European arrivals, beginning with the Vikings around 1,000 years ago. The Norse expeditions to North America represent one of history's more understated achievements, considering they managed to cross the North Atlantic in vessels that modern sailors would consider questionably seaworthy, using navigation techniques that relied heavily on intuition and apparently excellent sea sense. Leif Erikson and his fellow Norse explorers established a settlement at Lansog Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland around 1021 CE, creating what archaeologists now recognize as the first confirmed European settlement in the Americas. The Vikings approached North American colonization with their characteristic blend of pragmatism and optimism, though they quickly discovered that successful settlement required more than enthusiasm and well-crafted longships. The Norse called the region Vinland, though scholars continue to debate whether this referred to wine grapes or simply meant grassland, a linguistic uncertainty that has generated more academic discussion than the Vikings probably thought their naming. Conventions deserved. The settlement functioned primarily as a base camp for further exploration and resource extraction, particularly lumber, which was precious in Greenland and Iceland. Archaeological evidence suggests the Vikings occupied Lansog Meadows for perhaps only a decade, establishing workshops for ironworking and ship repair while exploring the surrounding coastlines. They encountered indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings, and these meetings apparently didn't always proceed smoothly, as the sagas record conflicts that may have contributed to the eventual abandonment of the settlement. The Viking withdrawal from North America around 1030 CE left the continent to its indigenous inhabitants for nearly 5 more centuries. This interlude allowed indigenous civilizations to continue their development without European interference, though it also meant that when the next wave of European explorers arrived, they would encounter societies that had no recent memory of European contact and little reason to expect what was coming. The next confirmed European contact came in the late 1500s with explorers like John Cabot, who reached the Atlantic coast in 1497 while searching for a western route to Asia. Cabot's voyage represented the beginning of sustained European interest in North America, though like many explorers of his era, he wasn't entirely sure what he had found and remained optimistically convinced he was somewhere near China. French exploration began in earnest with Jacques Cartier's voyages in the 1530s. Cartier sailed up the Strait, Lawrence River, in 1535, becoming the first European to penetrate deeply into the North American interior via this crucial waterway. He encountered Iroquoian-speaking peoples at Stadacona, near present-day Quebec City, and at Hochelaga, near modern Montreal, establishing the first detailed European accounts of indigenous civilizations in the region. Cartier's interactions with indigenous peoples set patterns that would characterize European indigenous relations for centuries to come. He was impressed by their knowledge of the landscape and their sophisticated social organization, but he also demonstrated the European tendency to impose their own cultural categories on indigenous societies, often missing crucial aspects of how these societies actually functioned. The name Canada itself comes from this period, derived from the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. Cartier heard this word used by his indigenous guides to describe their communities and assumed it referred to the entire region, creating one of history's more significant linguistic misunderstandings. The misinterpretation stuck, and an entire country ended up named after what was essentially a translation error, though considering the complexity of accurately naming a place this large, perhaps any name would have been somewhat inadequate. Samuel de Champlain's arrival in 1603 marked the beginning of sustained French colonial effort in North America. Champlain approached exploration and settlement with a combination of practical experience and genuine curiosity about indigenous cultures that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He spent considerable time living with indigenous peoples, learning their languages and customs, while developing the diplomatic relationships that would become crucial to French survival in North America. Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, establishing the first permanent French settlement in what would become Canada. The site was strategically chosen where the Strait, Lawrence River narrows, giving the French control over inland water transportation while providing access to the complex trade networks that indigenous peoples had maintained for centuries. The early French colonial approach differed significantly from Spanish or English colonization patterns. Rather than immediately displacing indigenous peoples, the French initially focused on establishing trading relationships and military alliances. This approach reflected both practical necessity — the French colonial population remained small for decades — and a recognition that indigenous peoples possessed knowledge and skills essential for survival in North American environments. French traders, explorers, and missionaries developed relationships with indigenous communities that produced a new cultural group, the Métis. Beginning in the mid-1600s, marriages between French men and indigenous women, particularly Cree and Ojibwe, created mixed communities with their own distinct culture, language, and identity. The Métis would later play crucial roles in Western Canadian development, serving as interpreters, guides, and traders, while maintaining their own unique position between European and Indigenous societies. The fur trade became the economic foundation of New France, creating relationships between European and indigenous peoples that were simultaneously cooperative and transformative. Indigenous nations became partners in a trade network that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, but this partnership also introduced European goods, diseases, and cultural practices that would profoundly alter traditional ways of life. European diseases proved particularly devastating to indigenous populations who had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and other illnesses. Population decline in some areas reached catastrophic levels, disrupting traditional social structures and political relationships, while creating power vacuums that European colonizers would later exploit. As French exploration expanded westward through the Great Lakes region and eventually toward the Pacific, the patterns established in these early encounters continued to shape relationships between indigenous and European peoples. The French approach emphasized alliance and accommodation rather than immediate conquest, though this would change as European populations grew and land pressures increased. The legacy of these early encounters established foundations for relationships that continue to evolve today. Indigenous peoples maintained their distinct identities and governance systems while adapting to European presence, creating a complex cultural landscape that defied simple categories of European or indigenous. Before any European had set foot in what would become Canada, this land was already home to sophisticated civilizations with rich cultural traditions, complex governance systems, and sustainable relationships with their environment. The arrival of Vikings and later French explorers initiated a process of cultural contact and change that continues to shape Canadian society today. Understanding this foundation helps illuminate why Canada developed as it did, not as a simple extension of European civilization, but as a unique society shaped by indigenous knowledge, European ambitions, and the ongoing process of negotiation between different ways of understanding land, community, and nationhood in this vast and varied continent. The seeds of modern Canada were thus planted not in European courts or colonial offices, but in the countless daily interactions between indigenous peoples and European arrivals and trading posts, where different languages merged into new forms of communication, in alliances forged through shared challenges of survival, and in the marriages and partnerships that created new communities with their own distinct identities. These early relationships established patterns of adaptation and accommodation that would distinguish Canadian development from other colonial experiences, creating a foundation upon which a genuinely multicultural society could eventually be built. The story of Canada begins here, in this complex and ongoing conversation between peoples who brought different traditions, knowledge, and dreams to a shared northern landscape. Chapter 3. From New France to British North America. Having explored the vast landscapes that would become Canada and the rich indigenous civilizations that first flourished here, we now turn to one of history's more dramatic episodes of imperial musical chairs. The transformation of New France into British North America unfolded through wars, treaties, and acts of parliament, with all the grace and subtlety of a moose attempting ballet, which is to say, impressive in its own way, but not necessarily what anyone expected when the music started. For over a century and a half, New France had established itself as a distinctive colonial society along the St. Lawrence River and throughout the Great Lakes region. By 1750, this French empire in North America stretched from Louisiana to Hudson Bay, connected by waterways and fur trade routes that made it appear magnificently vast on maps, though rather thinly populated in reality. The colony had approximately 70,000 French-speaking inhabitants, most of whom had grown quite attached to their particular way of life and had no particular desire to become British subjects. Thank you very much. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, erupted in 1756 as the latest installment in what historians diplomatically call the long struggle for colonial supremacy, though contemporary participants probably used less diplomatic language. This conflict would prove to be the decisive moment in determining whether North America would speak French or English, a question that had been simmering with increasing intensity for decades. The war's North American theatre began with skirmishes in the Ohio River Valley, where French and British territorial claims overlapped with the kind of precision one might expect from two empires drawing maps based on second-hand reports from explorers who may or may not have been entirely certain where they were at the time. Both sides enlisted Indigenous allies, creating a complex web of alliances that reflected the sophisticated diplomatic landscape Indigenous nations had maintained for centuries. Initially, French forces performed admirably, winning victories at Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757. The Marquis de Montcalm demonstrated considerable tactical skill while working with limited resources and the constant challenge of getting reinforcements across an ocean controlled by an increasingly powerful British Navy. The French strategy relied heavily on their Indigenous allies and their superior knowledge of North American geography, advantages that had served them well for over a century. However, the British eventually mobilized their superior resources with the kind of methodical determination that had made them a global naval power. Under the direction of William Pitt the Elder, British strategy shifted from tentative colonial skirmishing to full-scale imperial warfare. The British Navy blockaded French supply lines, while British and colonial armies attacked French strongholds with increasing coordination and overwhelming numbers. The capture of Louisbourg in July 1758 opened the seaway to the Strait, Lawrence River, effectively cutting New France's lifeline to Europe. This fortress city on Cape Breton Island had been France's key to controlling access to their North American empire, and its fall left Quebec City exposed to British naval assault. The writing was quite literally on the wall, assuming anyone in Quebec could read English, which many could not. The climactic moment came on September 13th, 1759, when British forces under General James Wolfe scaled the cliffs below Quebec City in what must rank among history's more audacious military maneuvers. The fact that this surprise attack succeeded suggests either exceptional British planning or remarkably poor French sentries, though historians generally credit the former, while acknowledging that military history is full of moments when the improbable becomes inevitable. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted less than 30 minutes, but determined the fate of a continent. Both commanding generals, Wolfe and Montcalm, died from wounds sustained in the battle, creating one of those poetic historical moments that would inspire countless paintings and epic poems, though probably providing little comfort to their respective armies. Wolfe's famous last words, allegedly, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace," became legendary, though some historians suggest he may have said something more prosaic and considerably less quotable. The fall of Quebec City effectively ended French hopes of retaining their North American empire, though fighting continued until Montreal surrendered in September 1760. The conquest was complete when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, formally transferring New France to British control and ending nearly 2.5 centuries of French imperial presence in what would become Canada. the British now faced the considerable challenge of governing 70,000 French-speaking Catholic inhabitants who had suddenly become British subjects without being consulted about their preferences in the matter. This presented a delicate political and cultural problem that would test British colonial administrative skills and establish precedents for multicultural governance that would influence Canadian development for centuries. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 initially attempted to transform Quebec into a conventional British colony by imposing English law, Protestant governance, and British institutions. This approach assumed that French Canadians would gradually assimilate into British culture, an assumption that demonstrated either remarkable optimism or profound misunderstanding of how cultural identity actually works. The proclamation also created administrative boundaries that ignored existing settlement patterns and Indigenous territorial relationships, establishing a pattern of bureaucratic geography that would characterize colonial administration. However, practical governance proved more complicated than proclamations suggested. French Canadians showed no inclination to abandon their language, religion, or legal traditions simply because their new rulers thought this would be convenient. British administrators quickly discovered that effective governance required accommodation rather than assimilation, particularly when dealing with a population that outnumbered English-speaking colonists by roughly 10 to 1. The Quebec Act of 1774 represented a dramatic reversal of British policy and one of the more enlightened pieces of colonial legislation in British imperial history. This act restored French civil law, guaranteed freedom of Catholic worship, and maintained the seigneurial system of land tenure that French colonists understood and preferred. The act essentially acknowledged that Quebec would remain distinctly French while operating within the British imperial system. The Quebec Act also expanded the boundaries of Quebec to include much of what is now southern Ontario and the American Midwest, incorporating territories where French traders and Indigenous nations had established relationships. This territorial expansion reflected British recognition of existing economic and diplomatic networks, while simultaneously creating administrative control over vast regions that might otherwise have remained ungoverned. Unfortunately for British imperial ambitions, the Quebec Act proved highly unpopular among the 13 colonies to the south. American colonists viewed the act as one of the intolerable acts because it granted Catholic rights that Protestant colonies found offensive and extended Quebec's borders into territories that American colonists hoped to settle themselves. The act's tolerance for French civil law and Catholic governance struck many Americans as evidence that Britain was willing to compromise Protestant principles and English legal traditions when politically convenient. The timing was particularly unfortunate, as the Quebec Act was passed just as relations between Britain and the American colonies reached a breaking point. American colonial leaders interpreted the act as proof that Britain would impose arbitrary government and foreign legal systems when it suited imperial interests, reinforcing their arguments about British tyranny and the need for colonial self-governance. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, the Quebec Act's political wisdom became apparent. French Canadians remained largely loyal to Britain, not because they loved British rule, but because the British had demonstrated willingness to protect French Canadian culture and institutions. This loyalty proved crucial when American forces invaded Quebec in 1775 and 1776, seeking to add Quebec as a 14th rebellious colony. The American invasion failed partly due to French-Canadian indifference to American appeals for revolutionary solidarity. Why should French Canadians risk their recently restored rights to join a rebellion led by English-speaking Protestants who who had loudly denounced the very law that protected French-Canadian interests. The logic of revolution proved considerably less compelling when viewed from Quebec City than from Boston or Philadelphia. The American Revolution's conclusion in 1783 brought unexpected consequences for British North America. The Treaty of Paris that ended the war created a new international border that separated the British colonies from the newly independent United States. But this border proved more porous than diplomatic documents suggested. Many inhabitants of the new United States discovered that independence looked better in theory than in practice, particularly if they had supported the Crown during the Revolution. The Loyalist migration that followed represents one of the largest population movements in early North American history. Approximately 50,000 to 80,000 Americans who had remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution chose exile rather than life in the new republic. These United Empire Loyalists, as they came to be known, brought their families, their possessions, and their political principles to British North America, dramatically altering the demographic and cultural landscape of what would become Canada. The Loyalists were not a homogeneous group despite their shared political allegiance. They included wealthy merchants and professionals from New York and Boston, small farmers from the backcountry, recently arrived immigrants who felt no particular attachment to American independence, and African Americans who had gained freedom by joining British forces. About 3,000 black Loyalists settled primarily in Nova Scotia, creating communities that faced particular challenges in a society where slavery remained legal and racial discrimination was commonplace. Indigenous peoples also faced difficult choices during and after the American Revolution. Many indigenous nations, particularly the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, had allied with Britain because they viewed British officials as more reliable protectors of indigenous territorial rights than American settlers who consistently pressed for westward expansion. When Britain lost the war, these indigenous allies found themselves in an impossible position. Approximately 2,000 Haudenosaunee, led by Thayendanegea, known to Europeans as Joseph Brant, migrated to British North America rather than remain under American jurisdiction. These indigenous loyalists received land grants along the Grand River in what is now southern Ontario, establishing communities that maintained Haudenosaunee governance and cultural traditions while adapting to new political circumstances. The Loyalist influx created immediate practical problems for British administrators who suddenly needed to find land, provisions, and shelter for tens of thousands of refugees arriving with little beyond their political convictions and justified grievances against their former neighbours. Nova Scotia received the largest single influx, with approximately 35,000 Loyalists settling in a colony that had previously contained fewer than 20,000 inhabitants. This demographic revolution led to the creation of New Brunswick in 1784, carved out of Nova Scotia to provide separate governance for the Loyalist settlements around the Bay of Fundy. The new colony adopted the optimistic motto, "Hope Restored," reflecting both Loyalist determination to rebuild their lives and British commitment to supporting those who had sacrificed for the Crown. In Quebec, Loyalist settlement concentrated in the western regions around Lake Ontario and the upper St. Lawrence River, areas that had been sparsely populated under French rule. These English-speaking Protestant settlers brought different cultural traditions, legal expectations, and economic practices to a colony that had been designed to accommodate French Catholic institutions. The resulting cultural tensions proved manageable but persistent. French Canadians had no particular desire to live under English common law or Protestant governance, while Loyalist settlers found French civil law and Catholic influence incompatible with their expectations of British colonial society. Both groups considered themselves loyal British subjects, but they held very different ideas about what British loyalty should mean in practice. These demographic and cultural changes set the stage for the Constitutional Act of 1791, which divided Quebec into two separate colonies: Lower Canada, with its French-speaking Catholic majority, and Upper Canada, designed primarily for English-speaking Protestant settlers. This division acknowledged that British North America would be bilingual and bicultural while providing separate political structures that could accommodate different legal and religious traditions. The Constitutional Act also introduced representative government to both Canadas through elected assemblies, though real power remained with appointed governors and legislative councils. This system attempted to balance democratic participation with imperial control, creating political institutions that would evolve over the following decades through negotiation, compromise, and occasional rebellion. By 1791, British North America had become something entirely different from what either French or British imperial planners had originally envisioned. It was neither a simple extension of British society nor a continuation of New France, but rather a complex political arrangement that accommodated multiple languages, legal traditions, and cultural identities within a single imperial framework. This transformation established the fundamental patterns that would characterize Canadian political development: the accommodation of diversity through federal arrangements, the maintenance of cultural distinctiveness within shared political institutions, and the evolution of governance through gradual reform rather than revolutionary change. The British conquest of New France had created not just a change of imperial allegiance, but the foundation for a new kind of political society. The 40 years from the fall of Quebec to the Constitutional Act witnessed the creation of British North America as a political entity distinct from both its French origins and its British governance. This period established Canada's characteristic approach to cultural diversity, federal governance, and gradual constitutional evolution principles that would guide the country's development through Confederation and beyond. Chapter 4: Birth of a Nation, Confederation, and Growing Pains. As we venture into the middle decades of the 19th century, we encounter one of those remarkable periods when abstract political ideas somehow transform into concrete national realities, though rarely without considerable drama and the occasional bout of what polite observers might call robust parliamentary disagreement. The transformation of British North America into the Dominion of Canada represents one all of history's more successful exercises in political engineering, assuming one considers success to include periodic rebellion, financial near collapse, and the kind of nation building that requires both exceptional optimism and a remarkably high tolerance for uncertainty. The War of 1812 had done something unexpected to the scattered British colonies in North America. It had convinced them they were not Americans. This revelation came as something of a surprise to many inhabitants who had previously given little thought to their collective identity, being rather preoccupied with the practical challenges of surviving Canadian winters and avoiding various forms of wildlife that seemed unreasonably aggressive by European standards. The war demonstrated that British North Americans could defend themselves when properly motivated, though it also revealed the considerable challenges of maintaining military coordination across vast distances, with communication systems that relied heavily on horses and optimism. The successful defence of Canada created the first stirrings of what might generously be called Canadian nationalism, though this early patriotic sentiment remained somewhat confused about its ultimate objectives, and prone to heated disagreements about whether French or English should be the language of choice for expressing loyalty to the crown. However, the decades following the War of 1812 brought new challenges that made military defense seem relatively straightforward by comparison. The political systems established in Upper and Lower Canada under the Constitutional Act of 1791 had developed what political scientists delicately describe as structural tensions, though contemporary. Observers use considerably more colourful language to describe governments that seem designed to frustrate anyone attempting to govern effectively. Both colonies operated under constitutional arrangements that combined elected assemblies with appointed executive councils, creating a system where elected representatives could complain vigorously about government policies, while appointed officials could ignore these complaints with the serene confidence of people whose positions depended on imperial favour, rather than popular support. This arrangement satisfied almost no one except those appointed officials who had grown comfortable with the advantages of unaccountable power. By the 1830s, frustration with these political arrangements had reached levels that made peaceful reform seem increasingly unlikely, and violent rebellion appear correspondingly attractive to those who had exhausted more conventional forms of political expression. The rebellions of 1837 erupted with the predictable timing of political upheavals that have been building pressure for decades, though with considerably less coordination than their leaders had hoped. In Lower Canada, Louis-Joseph Papineau and his patriots led what amounted to the first serious attempt to establish responsible government in British North America, though their definition of responsible government included several elements that British officials found objectionably Republican. The Patriots had spent years peacefully demanding democratic reforms, control over colonial revenues, and recognition of French-Canadian culture, requests that the Colonial Office received with about as much enthusiasm as one might expect from imperial administrators who considered stability more important than justice. When peaceful petitions failed to produce meaningful reform, the more radical patriots concluded that armed rebellion represented their only remaining option, a decision that demonstrated either admirable commitment to democratic principles or spectacular misjudgment about their military prospects, depending on one's perspective on the relationship between political idealism and practical strategy. The rebellion in Lower Canada proved more serious and sustained than its Upper Canadian counterpart, though neither uprising demonstrated the kind of popular support that successful revolutions generally require. British regular troops and loyal militia suppressed both rebellions, with the methodical efficiency that characterized imperial military responses to colonial unrest, though not without considerable property destruction and several hundred casualties. In Upper Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie led a rebellion that combined democratic idealism with remarkably poor tactical planning. Mackenzie's political critique of the family compact was considerably more sophisticated than his military strategy, which appeared to rely heavily on the assumption that gathering armed farmers at Montgomery's Tavern would somehow overwhelm Toronto's defences through sheer moral authority. The Battle of Montgomery's Tavern lasted approximately 30 minutes and settled Upper Canada's constitutional future with the kind of decisive efficiency that political negotiations had failed to achieve over several decades. Most rebels fled when the shooting started, demonstrating either admirable restraint or insufficient commitment to revolutionary change, depending on one's views about the appropriate relationship between political conviction and personal safety. The failed rebellions produced several important consequences, none of which the rebels had intended, but which proved more beneficial to colonial development than successful revolutions might have been. The British government, shocked by the prospect of losing more North American colonies to Republican sentiment, dispatched John George Lambton, 1st Earl of Durham, to investigate the causes of colonial unrest and recommend solutions that would prevent future rebellions. Lord Durham approached his assignment with methodical thoroughness, understanding that colonial administration failures could damage political careers. His report on the affairs of British North America, published in 1839, demonstrated remarkable insight into colonial problems, while showing blindness to certain cultural realities he found inconvenient. Durham recommended responsible government, whereby colonial executives would answer to elected legislatures rather than appointed governors, and the union of Upper and Lower Canada. The first recommendation addressed the democratic deficit that fueled rebellions, while the second reflected his belief that French Canadians could be assimilated into English Canadian culture through demographic overwhelm. The Union Act of 1841 created the province of Canada by merging Upper and Lower Canada into Canada West and Canada East, respectively, though this administrative change failed to eliminate the cultural and political differences that Durham had hoped to resolve through legislative merger. French Canadians demonstrated the same stubborn attachment to their language, religion, and legal traditions after Union that they had shown before Union, apparently not understanding that administrative efficiency required cultural conformity. Responsible government arrived gradually through political negotiation rather than legislative proclamation, finally achieved in 1848 when Lord Elgin allowed Robert Baldwin and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine to form a government based on their legislative majority. This peaceful transition demonstrated that constitutional evolution could accomplish what military rebellion had failed to achieve. The achievement of responsible government solved the immediate constitutional crisis, but created new challenges for British North American development. Democratic government required colonial politicians to address the concerns of their constituents rather than simply implementing imperial policies, a change that proved more complicated than many had anticipated. Elected representatives discovered that satisfying colonial voters often conflicted with maintaining harmonious relations with British officials, while satisfying British officials typically conflicted with winning colonial elections. By the 1850s, the province of Canada faced institutional gridlock, where governmental systems became so balanced they could no longer govern effectively. Equal representation for Canada West and Canada East, despite different populations, created legislative stalemate when sections disagreed, which they did with impressive consistency. Canada West's growing population meant equal representation, increasingly frustrated English-Canadian demands for representation by population, while Canada East's French-Canadian majority used guaranteed seats to protect cultural institutions against assimilation attempts. Neither section could impose its will, but both could prevent effective governance. This constitutional deadlock coincided with external pressures that made effective government seem increasingly urgent. The American Civil War demonstrated the dangers of federal systems that allowed regional differences to escalate into armed conflict, while also showing the military potential of unified republican governments. British North Americans worried about American territorial ambitions, particularly after the war ended and left the United States with the world's largest and most experienced army. Economic pressures added urgency to political concerns. The Reciprocity Treaty governing Canadian-American trade since 1854 was cancelled by the United States in 1866, partly as retaliation for British sympathy with the Confederacy. British North American colonies faced reduced American markets just when they needed economic growth. The Charlottetown Conference of September 1864 began as a maritime delegates meeting to discuss maritime union, but expanded when Canadian politicians requested permission to present their own ideas about British North American Federation. The Canadians arrived with detailed proposals and impressive entertainment budgets, both proving more effective than maritime union planning. George Brown, George Etienne Cartier, and John A. Macdonald presented Confederation as a solution to multiple problems: constitutional deadlock in Canada, economic uncertainty throughout British North America, defense concerns created by American military power, and administrative inefficiencies preventing effective governance across vast territories. Federation would create a larger political unit capable of continental development while preserving local autonomy. The Quebec Conference of October 1864 produced the Quebec Resolutions, which outlined the constitutional framework for British North American Federation. These 72 resolutions addressed everything from federal and provincial powers to Senate representation, creating a federal system that balanced central authority with provincial autonomy. The London Conference of December 1866 finalised Confederation details and produced the British North America Act, which the British Parliament enacted in 1867. The new Dominion of Canada came into existence on July 1st, 1867, comprising 4 provinces, Ontario and Quebec, created from the former province of Canada, and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Sir John A. Macdonald became Canada's first Prime Minister, a position he would hold for 19 of the Dominion's first 24 years. Macdonald approached nation-building with practical creativity, understanding that successful countries required both inspiring vision and pragmatic compromise, qualities he demonstrated through policies that were ambitious yet adaptable. Macdonald's national policy combined protective tariffs, Western settlement, and railway construction into an integrated development strategy. The policy assumed high tariffs would protect Canadian manufacturing, railway construction would connect markets, and Western settlement would provide customers and agricultural exports. The transcontinental railway promise became central to Canadian expansion, serving practical and symbolic functions. Railway construction would connect scattered colonies physically while demonstrating Canada's commitment to continental development. Manitoba joined Confederation in 1870 as Canada's 5th province, created from the Red River settlement where Louis Riel had led the first of his challenges to Canadian authority. The Manitoba Act represented an early test of Canadian federalism, demonstrating that the new Dominion could accommodate cultural diversity while asserting territorial sovereignty. British Columbia's entry into Confederation in 1871 required promises that tested Canadian capabilities. The province demanded a transcontinental railway within 10 years, a commitment that seemed reasonable to Ottawa politicians who had never built railways through the Rocky Mountains. Prince Edward Island joined Confederation in 1873, primarily because the island's railway debts threatened provincial bankruptcy. The island's entry demonstrated that Confederation could be as much about financial necessity as political vision. Railway construction proceeded with heroic persistence, characteristic of 19th century engineering projects, though not without considerable controversy and engineering challenges that sometimes seemed to exceed human capabilities. The Pacific Scandal of 1873 brought down Macdonald's government when railway contracts were awarded through processes prioritizing political contributions over competitive bidding. The Canadian Pacific Railway's completion in 1885 represented one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century, connecting Pacific and Atlantic coasts through previously impassable terrain. The railway required technological innovation, international labor recruitment, and financial commitments that occasionally threatened bankruptcy. The Northwest Rebellion of 1885 tested both the railway's military utility and Canada's ability to maintain order across vast territories. When Louis Riel returned from exile to lead another Métis uprising, Canadian forces used the nearly completed railway to transport troops to Saskatchewan with unprecedented speed. Riel's execution after the rebellion created lasting tensions between English and French Canada, showing that Confederation had not eliminated cultural conflicts but transferred them to federal politics. The controversy demonstrated that national unity would require constant negotiation rather than single constitutional settlements. By the 1880s, Canada had established itself as a transcontinental nation with functioning federal institutions, though the process required more time, money, and political compromise than anticipated. The Dominion had grown from 4 to 7 provinces, connected by transcontinental railway, that made national unity physically possible. The achievement of transcontinental unity represented remarkable transformation from scattered, fractious colonies. Where once British North Americans struggled to maintain basic communication across vast distances, they had created a federal democracy capable of governing from sea to sea. The early decades of Confederation demonstrated both possibilities and limitations of federal democracy in a vast, diverse country. Canada had avoided regional conflicts that tore apart the American Federation during Civil War, but had not eliminated regional tensions that would continue challenging national unity. The growing pains of nationhood revealed that successful confederations required more than constitutional documents and railway construction. They needed shared institutions, common purposes, and political leaders capable of balancing regional interests with national objectives. Canada had begun developing these qualities, setting foundation for a federal democracy that would face new challenges as it matured. Chapter 5. From Hardship to Triumph, Canada, Between the Wars and World War II. The Great War had ended, with Canada emerging as a more confident nation on the world stage, but the 20s brought their own unique challenges and transformations. Like a family gathering after a difficult period, Canadians were eager to embrace normalcy while still processing the profound changes that war had brought to their society. The 1920s began with what historians call the Red Scare, a period when fear of communist revolution swept across North America like wildfire through dry prairie grass. In Canada, this manifested in the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, when 35,000 workers walked off their jobs in solidarity with metal workers and building trades employees. For 6 weeks, the city of Winnipeg became a laboratory for labor relations, with striking workers organizing their own police force and food distribution system. The federal government, viewing this through the lens of post-war anxiety, deployed the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and arrested strike leaders. The strike's violent end, on what became known as Bloody Saturday, left 2 dead and dozens injured, but also established important precedents for workers' rights and collective bargaining that would shape Canadian labour relations for decades to come. Despite these early tensions, the 1920s generally brought prosperity and modernisation to much of Canada. The country experienced what Americans called the Roaring Twenties, though Canadians, ever mindful of propriety, might have preferred to call it the the moderately enthusiastic 20s. Cities grew rapidly as people moved from farms to factory jobs. The automobile revolutionized daily life, though many rural Canadians still regarded these mechanical contraptions with the same suspicious fascination they might reserve for a circus elephant performing in their barn. Radio broadcasting began in earnest, with stations like CFCF in Montreal and CKAC bringing entertainment, news, and the slightly crackling voices of distant announcers into Canadian homes for the first time. Women had gained the federal vote during the war, and the 20s saw continued expansion of women's rights and social participation. The famous five, Emily Murphy, Nellie McClung, Irene Palby, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards, challenged the legal definition of persons under the British North America Act. Their case, which reached the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in 1929, established that women were indeed persons qualified to sit in the Senate. This victory came with a certain irony, as the same British court that granted Canadian women this recognition would later strike down much of Bennett's New Deal legislation on constitutional grounds, demonstrating the complex relationship between Canadian autonomy and imperial legal structures. The economic prosperity of the 20s, however, was built on increasingly shaky foundations. Like a house of cards in a gentle breeze, the whole structure appeared stable until the wind picked up. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday on the New York Stock Exchange sent shockwaves across the Atlantic that reached Canadian markets with devastating effect. What began as a financial crisis quickly became a full-blown economic catastrophe that would define the next decade of Canadian history. The Great Depression struck Canada with particular severity, as a nation heavily dependent on exporting natural resources, wheat, timber, minerals, and fish. Canada was especially vulnerable to the collapse in international trade. Wheat prices plummeted from $1.60 per bushel in 1929 to 38 cents by 1932. Unemployment soared to nearly 30% by 1933, with some regions experiencing even higher rates. The prairie provinces were hit by a double catastrophe: economic collapse combined with severe drought conditions that created the Dust Bowl, turning once fertile farmland into something resembling the surface of Mars after a particularly bad day. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, perhaps demonstrating the political survival instincts of a particularly canny prairie gopher, initially downplayed the crisis. His famous declaration that he wouldn't give a 5-cent piece to conservative provincial governments for unemployment relief became a political albatross that contributed to his defeat in the 1930 election. King's replacement, Richard Bedford Bennett, brought a very different approach to the Prime Minister's office. A millionaire lawyer from Calgary, Bennett was known for his expensive tastes, formal manner, and the unfortunate timing of becoming Prime Minister just as the country's worst economic crisis was deepening. Bennett initially pursued traditional conservative remedies, higher tariffs to protect Canadian industry and moderate relief programs. The Bennett government established unemployment relief camps under the Department of National Defence, which housed unemployed single men in remote locations where they worked on infrastructure projects for 20 cents per day plus room and board. While these camps provided basic sustenance, they became symbols of government inadequacy and social control. The men in these camps, derisively called Bennett slave camps, organized protests and eventually mounted the On to Ottawa Trek in 1935, a cross-country march that ended in violent confrontation with police in Regina. As the Depression deepened and traditional remedies proved ineffective, Bennett underwent a remarkable political transformation. Inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, Bennett announced his own series of reforms in a dramatic series of radio broadcasts in January 1935. With the enthusiasm of a convert and the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver, Bennett promised unemployment insurance, minimum wage laws, maximum hour legislation, agricultural support, and expanded old age pensions. This sudden embrace of government intervention shocked his conservative colleagues and the Canadian public alike. Bennett's New Deal represented a fundamental shift in Canadian political thinking about the role of government in economic and social affairs. The legislation included the Employment and Social Insurance Act, which established unemployment insurance, the Minimum Wage Act, the Limitation of Hours of Work Act, and various measures to regulate business practices and support agriculture. However, these reforms came too late to save Bennett's political career. The 1935 election returned Mackenzie King and the Liberals to power with a decisive majority, and in 1937, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council declared much of Bennett's New Deal legislation unconstitutional, ruling that these matters fell under provincial rather than federal jurisdiction. The constitutional crisis surrounding Bennett's New Deal highlighted ongoing tensions in Canadian federalism and the need for clearer division of powers between federal and provincial governments. The Rowell-Seroz Commission, appointed to study these issues, produced a comprehensive report in 1940 that recommended significant changes to federal-provincial financial arrangements. While many of these recommendations were not implemented until after World War II, they laid the groundwork for the modern Canadian welfare state and the eventual achievement of unemployment insurance and other social programs through constitutional amendment and federal-provincial cooperation. The Depression years also saw significant political realignment, with the emergence of new parties representing different responses to economic crisis. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, founded in 1932, brought together farmers, labourers, and intellectuals behind a platform of democratic socialism. The CCF's Regina Manifesto called for public ownership of key industries, comprehensive social insurance, and economic planning to prevent future depressions. Meanwhile, in Alberta, William Bible Bill Aberhart's Social Credit Party gained power in 1935, with promises to distribute monthly dividends to all citizens, reflecting popular frustration with traditional economic theories and the appeal of seemingly simple solutions to complex problems. As the 1930s drew to a close, international tensions were rising in Europe and Asia. Canada, like a family member watching distant relatives argue at a reunion, hoped these conflicts would resolve themselves peacefully, but began making quiet preparations for the possibility that peaceful resolution might not be possible. The lessons of the First World War, about the speed with which global conflicts could escalate and the price of unpreparedness, influenced Canadian planning and policy making as war clouds gathered overseas. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Canada faced the familiar question of its relationship to British foreign policy, but this time with greater autonomy and more deliberate consideration. Unlike 1914, when Canada was automatically at war when Britain declared war, the country now had the constitutional independence to make its own decision. After a week of parliamentary debate, Canada declared war on September 10, 1939, demonstrating both its independence and its commitment to fighting fascism. This week-long delay, while symbolically important, was primarily ceremonial. Canadian war preparations had already begun. World War II transformed Canadian society more thoroughly and rapidly than perhaps any other event in the nation's history. The war effort demanded total mobilization of human and material resources on a scale that dwarfed even the impressive achievements of the First World War. By war's end, Canada had become one of the world's leading industrial powers, with an expanded manufacturing base, a transformed social structure, and a new sense of national confidence and international responsibility. The home front during World War II became a theatre of unprecedented social change and economic transformation. The federal government, having learned from the chaotic mobilization of 1914 to 1918, implemented comprehensive planning and controls from the war's beginning. The Wartime Prices and Trade Board, established in 1939 and expanded in 1941, managed a sophisticated system of wage and price controls, rationing, and resource allocation that maintained economic stability while supporting the war effort. Unlike the inflation and profiteering that had marked the First World War, these controls ensured that the burden of war was shared more equitably across Canadian society. Women's participation in the wartime economy represented perhaps the most visible and significant social change of the war years. As men enlisted for overseas service, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles previously reserved for men and proving their capabilities in everything from aircraft assembly to precision manufacturing. At the peak of war production in 1943 and 1944, over 400,000 women worked in manufacturing, with another 439,000 in service sectors. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter found her Canadian counterpart in real women like Elsie McGill, the world's first female aircraft designer who supervised the production of Hawker Hurricane fighter planes and became known as the Queen of the Hurricanes. The war economy's demands created opportunities and challenges that transformed traditional gender roles and social expectations. Women worked as welders, machinists, inspectors, and supervisors in munitions factories that produced everything from Bren guns to Lancaster bombers. Many travelled far from home for these opportunities. Young women from the maritime provinces and the prairies journeyed to industrial centres in Ontario and Quebec, often living in company-provided dormitories and experiencing independence and economic opportunities their mothers could never have imagined. The government's propaganda campaigns celebrated these contributions while carefully maintaining that women's wartime roles were temporary measures that would return to normal once the men came home. The massive expansion of war production also brought about significant technological and industrial advancement. Canada became one of the Allied powers' most important suppliers of military equipment, producing ships, aircraft, vehicles, and munitions that equipped not only Canadian forces, but also British, Soviet, and other Allied military units. The country's industrial output expanded exponentially, with new factories built and existing facilities converted for war production. This industrial transformation laid the foundation for Canada's post-war economic boom and established the country as a major manufacturing power rather than simply an exporter of raw materials. Rationing and resource conservation became part of daily life for Canadian families, but these restrictions were generally accepted with good grace as necessary contributions to the war effort. Families collected scrap metal, saved kitchen fat for glycerin production, and made do with limited quantities of sugar, butter, gasoline, and other scarce commodities. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and vacant lots, while women's organizations like the Women's Institutes expanded their traditional charitable work to include massive campaigns for knitting socks, rolling bandages, and preparing care packages for overseas troops. The slogan, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without," became a household motto that reflected both wartime necessity and the Canadian values of thrift and collective responsibility. However, the war also revealed the darker aspects of Canadian society and the limits of national unity. The treatment of Japanese Canadians after Pearl Harbor represented one of the most shameful episodes in Canadian history. Following the attack on December 7, 1941, fear and racism combined to produce the forced removal of over 22,000 Japanese Canadians from the Pacific coast. Families were separated, property was confiscated and sold at below-market prices, and entire communities were dispersed to internment camps in the interior of British Columbia and other provinces. This violation of civil liberties, justified at the time as a security measure, demonstrated how quickly fear could override democratic principles and constitutional protections. The war's end in 1945 found Canada transformed beyond recognition from the struggling, Depression-era country that had entered the conflict 6 years earlier. The nation emerged as the world's fourth largest industrial power, with a modern manufacturing sector, full employment, accumulated savings from wartime prosperity, and a new sense of international responsibility. The transition from wartime to peacetime economy, managed more successfully than after the First World War, set the stage for the unprecedented prosperity and social transformation of the post-war era. Canada had survived its greatest tests and emerged stronger, more unified, and more confident in its place in the world. Chapter 6. The True North Strong and Free. Modern Canada's Evolution. The end of World War II marked not just the conclusion of a devastating global conflict, but the beginning of Canada's emergence as a mature, prosperous, and increasingly confident nation. Like a young adult finally settling into their own apartment after years of sharing space with relatives, Canada was ready to define itself on its own terms while maintaining the family relationships that had shaped its character. The post-war economic boom transformed Canadian society more dramatically than perhaps any peacetime period in the nation's history. Veterans returning from overseas married, started families, and embarked on buying sprees that had been impossible during the Depression and war years. The baby boom generation, born between 1946 and 1964, would reshape Canadian society for decades to come. Suburbs sprouted around every major city like mushrooms after spring rain, filled with ranch-style homes, gleaming appliances, and the promise of middle-class prosperity that had seemed like an impossible dream just a decade earlier. This prosperity was fueled by massive immigration that fundamentally altered Canada's demographic and cultural landscape. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, recognizing the danger that lay in a small population attempting to hold so great a heritage, opened Canada's doors to displaced persons from war-torn Europe. Between 1947 and 1957, over 1.2 million immigrants arrived in Canada, with the peak year of 1957 seeing 282,000 new arrivals. These weren't just economic migrants seeking opportunity, but refugees fleeing the ruins of their homelands and the advancing shadow of Soviet communism. The Displaced Persons Program brought nearly 200,000 refugees between 1947 and 1952, many of them highly educated professionals and skilled workers who had lost everything but their knowledge and determination. Polish veterans who had fought alongside Canadian forces, Holocaust survivors rebuilding their shattered lives, Hungarian refugees fleeing Soviet tanks in 1956, Dutch farmers seeking new agricultural frontiers, all contributed to what would become known as Canada's multicultural mosaic. Unlike the American melting pot metaphor, Canada was developing a model that celebrated ethnic diversity while building shared civic values. The 1950s brought unprecedented prosperity and suburban expansion, but also social tensions that would define Canadian political development for decades. In Quebec, the authoritarian rule of Maurice Duplessis was ending, and with it, an era of church-dominated conservative governance that had kept the province largely rural and traditional. When Duplessis died in 1959, followed quickly by his successor Paul Sauvé, the stage was set for revolutionary change that would shake the foundations of Canadian federalism. The election of Jean Lesage and the Liberal Party in Quebec in 1960 marked the beginning of the Quiet Revolution, a transformation so profound that it seemed to occur overnight, though its roots had been growing for years beneath the surface of Quebec society. With the slogan Maîtres chez nous, masters in our own house, Lesage's government embarked on a sweeping modernization program that secularized education, nationalized hydroelectric power, expanded the civil service, and dramatically increased Quebec's role in its own economic development. It was like watching a chrysalis transform into a butterfly, except the butterfly had strong opinions about federal-provincial relations. The Quiet Revolution unleashed forces that would reshape not just Quebec, but all of Canada. The growth of Quebec nationalism, initially focused on economic and social modernization, gradually evolved toward more fundamental questions about Quebec's place in Confederation. René Lévesque, who had gained prominence overseeing the nationalization of Quebec's electrical system as a Liberal cabinet minister, would eventually leave the party to found the Parti Québécois in 1968, dedicated to the goal of Quebec independence. The stage was set for constitutional struggles that would dominate Canadian politics for the next half-century. Meanwhile, Canada was establishing itself as a respected middle power on the international stage. The country's role in creating the United Nations, its participation in NATO, and especially its pioneering work in international peacekeeping under Lester Pearson's leadership, earned Canada a reputation as an honest broker in global affairs. When Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis through the creation of the first UN peacekeeping force, it marked Canada's arrival as a significant player in international diplomacy. Canadian peacekeepers would serve in conflict zones around the world, their blue berets becoming symbols of Canada's commitment to peace and international cooperation. The 1960s brought social revolution to Canada, as they did to much of the Western world. The baby boom generation came of age with values quite different from their parents, embracing social change, challenging traditional authority, and demanding greater equality and individual rights. Women's liberation, civil rights movements, anti-war protests, and countercultural movements all found expression in Canadian society. The adoption of the maple leaf flag in 1965, replacing the red ensign with its British symbolism, reflected Canada's growing sense of independent identity, though not without considerable controversy and passionate debate in Parliament. The arrival of Pierre Trudeau as Prime Minister in 1968 represented a generational changing of the guard in Canadian politics. Young, intellectual, charismatic, and fluently bilingual, Trudeau embodied many Canadians' hopes for a modern, sophisticated country that could bridge linguistic and cultural divides. His vision of a just society and official bilingualism appealed to English-speaking Canadians who wanted to keep Quebec in Confederation, while his Quebec origins and intellectual credentials gave him credibility with Francophone intellectuals, though not with separatists who saw him as a traitor to the Quebec nationalist cause. Trudeau's implementation of official bilingualism in 1969 marked a fundamental shift in Canadian identity. The Official Languages Act recognized French and English as equal languages in federal institutions, courts, and services, attempting to make French-speaking Canadians feel at home anywhere in Canada while preserving French as more than just a regional language. The policy faced resistance from some English-speaking Canadians who saw it as expensive and unnecessary, but it also created new opportunities for bilingual Canadians and helped establish Canada's distinctive linguistic duality as a national characteristic. The October Crisis of 1970 represented the darkest moment of Quebec's independence movement, when the radical Front de Libération du Québec kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross and murdered Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte. Trudeau's invocation of the War Measures Act, bringing army troops into Quebec and suspending civil liberties, sparked intense debate about the balance between security and freedom in democratic society. While most Canadians supported Trudeau's strong response at the time, the crisis also revealed the deep currents of alienation and frustration that fed Quebec separatism. As Trudeau famously said when asked how far he would go in fighting terrorism, "Just watch me," words that would echo through Canadian political discourse for decades. The 70s brought new economic challenges and opportunities. The discovery of massive oil reserves in Alberta's tar sands, combined with rising global energy prices following the 1973 oil crisis, shifted Canada's economic centre of gravity westward and created new tensions between energy-producing and energy-consuming provinces. The National Energy Programme, implemented by Trudeau's government in 1980, attempted to ensure Canadian control over energy resources and provide Eastern Canada with secure oil supplies at controlled prices. However, the program was seen in Alberta as federal theft of provincial resources, creating lasting resentment that would influence Western Canadian politics for generations. The 1976 election of René Lévesque's Parti Québécois government in Quebec brought the independence question to the forefront of Canadian politics. Lévesque, a charismatic former journalist and television personality, promised good government while preparing for an eventual referendum on sovereignty association, a proposal for Quebec political independence combined with continued economic ties to Canada. The PQ's election victory sent shockwaves through English Canada and financial markets, demonstrating that Quebec separatism was no longer a fringe movement, but a serious political force representing the aspirations of a significant portion of Quebec society. The 1980 Quebec referendum became the defining political event of late 20th century Canada. Lévesque's government asked Quebecers for a mandate to negotiate sovereignty association with the rest of Canada, carefully avoiding the word independence in favour of language that suggested continued partnership. The referendum campaign was passionate and divisive, with Federalists led by Trudeau arguing that Quebec's future lay within Canada, while sovereignists insisted that only independence could protect Quebec's distinct culture and language. The Federalist victory, 60% to 40%, was decisive but not overwhelming, leaving the constitutional future unresolved while demonstrating the depth of Quebec's dissatisfaction with the status quo. Trudeau's response to the referendum victory was to fulfill his promise to renew federalism by patriating the Constitution from Britain and entrenching a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that would protect individual rights and official language minorities. This culminated in the Constitution Act of 1982, signed by Queen Elizabeth II on Parliament Hill on April 17th, a ceremony that symbolised Canada's final achievement of full sovereignty while simultaneously excluding Quebec, which refused to sign the agreement. Like a family portrait with one member conspicuously absent, the constitutional deal resolved some problems while creating others that would persist for decades. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms fundamentally transformed Canadian governance and society. For the first time, individual rights were constitutionally entrenched and could be enforced by courts against both federal and provincial governments. The Charter guaranteed fundamental freedoms like expression and religion, democratic rights including voting, mobility rights allowing Canadians to move freely within the country, legal rights protecting individuals in the justice system, equality rights prohibiting discrimination, and linguistic rights protecting official language minorities. It also recognized Canada's multicultural character and Aboriginal rights, though these latter provisions remained largely undefined. The Charter's impact on Canadian society was profound and immediate. Courts began striking down laws that violated Charter rights, forcing governments to rewrite discriminatory legislation and expanding protection for minority groups. Same-sex rights, women's equality, freedom of expression, and minority language education all received stronger legal protection. The Supreme Court of Canada evolved from a largely administrative tribunal focused on federal-provincial disputes into a powerful constitutional court whose decisions shaped social policy on issues from abortion to minority rights. Some critics argued that unelected judges were usurping the role of democratically elected politicians, while supporters saw the Charter as essential protection for minority rights against majority tyranny. The 1980s and 90s brought new challenges and transformations. The Meech Lake Accord, an attempt by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney to bring Quebec into the constitutional family with recognition as a distinct society, collapsed in 1990 after failing to gain approval from all provinces. The subsequent Charlottetown Accord, which attempted to address Aboriginal self-government, Senate reform, and Quebec's constitutional concerns in a comprehensive package, was rejected by Canadian voters in a national referendum in 1992. These failures demonstrated both the difficulty of constitutional change in Canada and the growing gap between political elites and ordinary citizens on constitutional questions. The near victory of the Yes side in the 1995 Quebec referendum, losing by less than 1 percentage point, shocked Canadians and came closer to breaking up the country than most had imagined possible. The campaign revealed deep divisions not just between federalists and sovereignists, but within Quebec society itself, as immigrant communities and Aboriginal peoples largely rejected independence, while Francophone Quebecers were almost evenly divided. Prime Minister Jacques Cartier's government responded with the Clarity Act, establishing clear rules for any future referendum, while implementing policies to increase federal visibility in Quebec and address some of the grievances that fed separatist sentiment. As Canada approached the new millennium, the country had evolved far beyond the vision of its 19th century founders. Immigration from Asia, Africa, and Latin America had made cities like Toronto and Vancouver among the most multicultural in the world. The 1,971 policy of official multiculturalism had evolved into a distinctive Canadian approach to diversity that celebrated ethnic differences while promoting shared civic values. Women had achieved formal equality and were entering professions and leadership roles in unprecedented numbers. Aboriginal peoples were asserting their rights and achieving greater self-government, though the legacy of residential schools and historical injustices remained pressing issues requiring ongoing reconciliation. The economy had also transformed beyond recognition. From a resource-dependent economy exporting raw materials to imperial markets, Canada had become a post-industrial knowledge economy integrated into global trade networks. The North American Free Trade Agreement connected Canada's economy more closely than ever to the United States and Mexico, while technological change enabled small Canadian companies to compete in global markets from coast to coast to coast. Regional differences remained significant features of Canadian life, but they had evolved in new directions. Atlantic Canada struggled with outmigration and economic decline as traditional fisheries and industries faced global competition. Quebec had become a confident, modern society with one of North America's most distinctive cultures, though the sovereignty question remained unresolved. Ontario remained Canada's economic heartland, but faced new competition from western cities. The prairie provinces had diversified beyond agriculture into energy, technology, and finance. British Columbia had become Canada's Pacific gateway, with Vancouver emerging as one of the world's most livable cities and a bridge between North America and Asia.